I may welcome Pena Brock from the Namibia Institute for Democracy. Hello, Pena Brock. Pena Brock is a Namibian academic researcher and has based a majority of her work to the Ovaherero and Nama Genocide, gender and memorialization, transitional justice and reparations. Pena Brock will now look at the historical and current situation in Namibia and issues of genocide recognition. The title of his speech is The Current Relevance of Historical Injustice, a look at the Ovaherero and Nama Genocide and today's context. Welcome, Pena Brock. We are looking forward to your speech.
Thank you so much for having me on this platform. It's really been, so interesting listening to the previous speaker and just seeing some of the similarities between Namibia and Tanzania. So thank you also to the previous speaker. I learned a lot from you as well. Sometimes I've just been so focused on the Namibian context that, just to look out and see the similarities has been so eye-opening. So as I've been introduced, my name is Pena Brock and I work at the Namibian Institute for Democracy. However, I've also published work on this topic around genocide, memorialization, politics of reparations. So there's so much to cover on the topic of Namibia, and the Ovaherero and Nama Genocide has really featured a lot in international news lately. And so there's just not a lot, I cannot cover everything because there's so many components to this. And just seeing that I might be short on time, I'm just gonna get straight to my presentation. Just 2 seconds. Okay. All right. Okay, so I thought it might be helpful to have a presentation guide me and also just to have some visuals. I think that would be very helpful to the discussion. So I'm looking at the current relevance of historical injustices, and this is specifically on the Ovaherero and Nama Genocide, but considering that it's been such a long time ago, so to say, the question of, well, isn't this too far in the past? Why does it have to be addressed? That is really the lens I want to go into this presentation with, because when we think about it, it actually hasn't been a very long time. We have a lot of Namibian elders who were raised by grandparents who are survivors of the genocide. And they have grown up seeing the complete trauma and that has still been instilled in their ancestors in terms of seeing their grandmother just break down. And this is obviously an intergenerational trauma, but it's not that long ago. So just to take us through the presentation, I'm gonna give a historical context, and it's an extensive context, and I will try to go through it as quickly as possible. And then we're going to look at the legacies of genocide in today's context, and then decolonization and memorialization in Namibia, because Namibia, when it comes to the German settler colonialism, attracted the largest amount of German settlers. And this means that our neighbors and our colleagues are of German descent. I myself, my surname Brock is actually a German surname, my father being German Namibian. My grandparents came here as German settlers. So this topic is not so far away from many Namibians. So we need to talk about the decolonization and memorialization in Namibia because the history is very, very pronounced here. So the historical context. Why I like to talk about Namibia before German colonialism is because a lot of the time our history books, especially even how I learned my history, was it starts in 1884 with the arrival of German colonialism. And it's such a huge injustice to African history because African history dates back centuries, but we only learn it under a Eurocentric scope where we have to say, okay, your history starts here with colonialism. So the Namibian history dates back thousands of years, and it involves the migration of different African groups that settled in Namibia. And the migration led to the establishment of local politics, trade, and economics. I cannot go through each migration or each cultural group that exists today in Namibia, but just to summarize that today, Namibia is home to roughly 11 different cultural groups. So, I'm going to go first with the Ovaherero. The Ovaherero, they are part of the Bantu migration, which comes from Central Western Africa, and they entered Namibia in the 16th century through the north of Namibia. And they occupied central and northern east region of Namibia by the 18th century. So they were around for a while, moving around Namibia in the northern areas, pushing down further. So they occupied, just to go back, slightly the central and eastern northern areas, and very good arable land, good rainfall in that area as well. And the important thing, they're pastoral, they're herders. So a lot of their culture and pride come from their livestock, which is cattle. And the land is there to be used for grazing. And especially when you look at some of the traditional wear, you will see that even the women wear the horns of the cows. It's a big part of their culture. And the Ovaherero can be broken into smaller clans. So with one result of colonialism, when Europeans came to Africa, they would look at certain groups and say, okay, well, your clan and this clan are somewhat similar, so we're just going to put you guys together because we see some similarities linguistically, but within the Ovaherero group, you can break it down into different clans and groups that have different dialects in language, have slightly different traditional wear, different cultural practices, but overall there are similarities, and this is why through colonialism they were grouped together. Which is why I also refer to the term cultural group and not tribe. So this is just a picture of who the Ovaherero looked like, how they dressed before colonialism. Then we have the Nama. The Nama, a very, very interesting group. They are part of the Orlam migration from South Africa, and which was known as the Cape Colony, where the Dutch had colonized and settled there. And they entered Namibia early 18th century, and they settled in southern central Namibia. So we can see the central part of Namibia is where the Ovaherero and the Nama kind of interact the most. So they have a very interesting, they are a mixed genetic pool. They are part Khoisan from South Africa that somehow with the Afrikaner, which are the Dutch settlers, mixed, and some are even part Malay, where you can see some slight Asian features at times. And the Malay came through the Malay slavery trade. So they were essentially, they worked for white settlers in the Cape Colony, and eventually they start to move northwards to flee the violence and the expansion of white settler farmers. And you will actually notice during the German colonialism period, the Namas were a lot harder to convince to cooperate with the German settlers because they knew what white settler colonialism meant. They experienced it firsthand. So the Nama acquired the Afrikaans and Khoisan language and Christianity, firearms, and warfare skills, and they could on horseback. And this is things they learned from the south. From South Africa. So just to look at how the Ovaherero and the Nama, very different cultural groups. And what is so important to understand is that Namibia was vibrant. It had local economies and politics, and there was conflict over land and cattle. The Nama were famous for raiding the Ovaherero for their cattle, so there was that conflict. But they also had to enter political treaties in order to govern which groups occupied which lands and to maintain peace. So, and also they also had their economy was building. By the end of the 19th century, trade and capital economies were growing in Namibia. The Nama and Ovaherero economies were linked to the trade in South Africa, and they would sell large herds of cattle and purchase different textiles, gunpowder, weapons, and alcohol. So why I mentioned the history of Namibia before is that when the German colonial administration arrived, they found vibrant and established societies. They didn't find a wasteland of a few scattered people doing nothing with the land. And this was the perfect opportunity for German settlers to come in and settle and farm. This obviously was going to lead to conflict because we have an established society or multiple established societies. So enters German colonialism. We have a German colonialism period in Namibia between 1884, which was the Berlin Conference, and 1915, which is when Germany lost their colonies in World War I. So German traders had already begun buying land from local Ovaherero and Nama chiefs. And this allowed, so when the German colonial administration envoys arrived, there was already few lands that had been bought, but the local chiefs had no way of knowing that what this selling a piece of land here and there could possibly entail. And this was, the aim was to make Namibia a settler colony for German citizenship to expand while increasing trade and access to resources. And we had the previous speaker talk about how different colonialism, there are different forms of colonialism, and settler colonialism, some have said, is one of the more violent forms of colonialism. But that is not in the scope of today's lecture. So because the Ovaherero and Nama were constantly prone to conflict over land and cattle, the German colonial administration took opportunity and they invited local chiefs to enter these so-called protection treaties that offered military alliance, weapons, and money in return for land and cattle. So this means that if I'm a Ovaherero chief and I'm fighting with a Nama chief over a certain land, I can enter a military alliance with these German colonial administration. They're offering me weapons. They're offering me an opportunity that I can reestablish my authority in a certain area. So the German colonial administration did take advantage of this. And there's also the issue that a lot of the Ovaherero and Nama chiefs in some ways were complicit, but there was still no way of condoning the full extent of colonialism. So what also is important to note is that not all peace treaties were done under peaceful circumstances. The famous Nama chief, Hendrik Witbooi, actually was attacked several times and even attacked women and children, and they were in a guerrilla war with the German soldiers until Hendrik Witbooi agreed to sign a peace treaty. And some sales were unfair. The German measuring system of a mile measures far greater than the British mile. So when you sell 20 miles of land, the local chiefs were not aware that they were actually selling a significantly bigger piece of land. So when we say some chiefs were complicit, we have to acknowledge that some of it was not done under fair circumstances and not peaceful circumstances either. So I just wanted to show us a picture. This is in 1904. This is actually the house of the Ovaherero paramount chief, Samuel Maherero, just to show that now the way of life has definitely started to change a little bit. They are living in brick houses. The dress is starting to change as well. You can see some people are dressed still in some traditional ways, but they call this the Christian clothing. People were starting to convert to Christianity. And here's another picture where you can still see a traditional homestead, but the way people are dressing is starting to look a little different. So the buildup of tension. The buildup of tension was always there. So we have the German colonial military wing, which is the Schutztruppe, and they were not always able to uphold their end of the peace treaties. There have been instances where they showed up late to a battle. So why did I sell you all this land if you're not upholding your end of the treaty? That was one issue. Then there was also German colonial law that was imposed almost on everyone, and this was not really consensual. So when a law was broken, it included a fine or confiscation of wealth and cattle. So if my cow was grazing on your piece of land, you confiscate my cattle and I don't get it back. So these were not the laws that locals were used to. And there was an increase of executions, beatings, and rapes by the Schutztruppe. And the missionaries actually have a record of just saying it was a colony slipping out of control when it came to the racial violence. And then you have the racially biased laws that did not offer protection to locals against crimes by German settlers and Schutztruppe against locals. So even if I am beaten by a drunk Schutztruppe, the chances are I will not get justice. He will be back in my street the next day and nothing changes. And then there was just a drastic loss of social, economic, and political power and rights of the locals. And I will also add their cultural power, because when we're talking about the cattle being such a huge part of the Ovaherero culture, that was a serious loss. They say by 1904, the Ovaherero had managed to retain 46,000 heads of cattle prior to the 100,000 cattle that they owned prior to German colonialism. But there was also a pest issue, so that's not the only reason why they lost cattle, but the tension was there. It was racially charged, and this then leads us to the 1904 Ovaherero Uprising. And just as the previous speaker said, to call things uprisings and rebellions means that there's an issue with that terminology, because some people will just call it the Ovaherero War, because their rights and their culture and their dominance was being completely obliterated. So it's actually should be called a war. But so this began in March 1904, and this is the result of built-up tension and is led by Paramount Chief Samuel Maharero. So the attacks were limited to German men, and the important thing here is that not all Ovaherero chiefs declared war on the settlers. And they actually, because of the nature of it was a lot of male settlers. There were only a few women. So the research shows that for every 100 male settlers, there were 19 German women. So you can already see this, it was the male dominance that was the main issue. And this is also why there was a lot of rape when you look at the ratio between German women and German men. And what happened to this war was Germany's response was quite exponential. You have the appointment of General von Trotter, a colonial specialist with a reputation of being very ruthless, and deployment of 2,000 German soldiers to Namibia. The colonial department financed the war with 585 million marks, which was given to General von Trotter's disposal to say, end the war by any means necessary. So this is where we can say that the war is starting to escalate into a genocide. And this is and it takes place between 1904 and 1908. So to say, let's say around August. So mind you, the uprising began March. By August, we can see that the German retaliation is quite exponential. And the genocide takes place over different means. It's civilian attacks, there's a hunt campaign, and there are concentration camps. So this takes place over the next 4 years. So as mentioned, escalation from war to genocide. We have military attacks on Ovaherero soldiers and civilians, including women and children. So this type of war tactic, while there were more Ovaherero soldiers, so to say, the German military, they had sophisticated weapons that that the Ovaherero did not stand a chance. So they were forced to flee into the Omaheke Desert. And the Omaheke Desert also plays a very painful memory in the genocide, because this was also a tactic of genocide. There was no water, no food in the desert. So they pushed the Ovaherero into the desert, and they're sure to perish, and thousands of Ovaherero did perish in the desert. We have a few that made it into modern day Botswana, including the chief Samuel Maherero. However, so many perished in the desert, and there's even oral histories that say that the women who had their babies could not survive, and they would breastfeed the soldiers because there was just no food, and just so that the soldiers could go out and try and fight or find food and come back. So you can see complete desperation, and this is what it was taken to, that women were breastfeeding the male soldiers. There's no official record that shows this, but from oral history, I've picked this up more than once. And so in October 1904, you have the extermination order, where Von Trotto ordered that any Ovaherero found would be executed. So every time they come out of the desert, they're executed if they're found. So you have this dilemma where, do I die by desert, or do I come out and am I executed? And this hunt campaign was extended to all Ovaherero groups, including those who were not part of the uprising. All Herero groups were targeted, and this is where we can see that this is not just a war on to settle a dispute. This is now to really gain access to all of this prime land that is owned by the Ovaherero. So we always hear about the Nama being such a crucial part of this history, and so after receiving the news of the hunt for the Ovaherero, the Nama declared war on the German troops in October. So again, remember, we say the Nama have always been more suspicious. They were even brought to compromise with the Germans under conflict. You know, they were not asked to sign a peace treaty peacefully. They were the ones that always had a bigger issue with the German or with white settlers. So they start their uprising, and they are actually very successful in guerrilla war tactics. But April 1905, there's a lot of historians and locals have accepted as the second extermination order. So this is when Namas in open rebellion are ordered to surrender or suffer the same fate as the Ovaherero. But while this can now be interpreted, is it an extermination order? Is it not? The thing is, when the Namas surrendered, they were given the same fate as the Ovaherero. So it's so to say that this was misleading, and they were placed in the same issues, the same position as Ovahereros. So this is the next 3 slides will be a few difficult images. However, I just think it's very important that we go in as sensitively as possible, because especially when I showed you that first picture of the Ovaherero, where they're in their traditional wear, they look full of life. This is what they were reduced to. So in 1905, the Kaiser allowed the surrender of Ovaherero and Nama and placed all survivors in concentration camps. And this was to rebuild the settler German colonial economy, which was ravished by the war. And due to starvation and complete desperation, the Ovaherero and Nama emerged from the desert, and they resembled skeletons. And it's also important, 75% of prisoners of war were women and children, because during the war, more men were killed. But a majority of the prisoners of war were women and children. And this is a narrative I always like to bring in, because often we write women out of history. So we see here, it is the systematic killing of prisoners of war, and this is done under harsh conditions. So while no one is necessarily being executed, the conditions provided to them are sure to kill them. So you have forced labor. These are women in Swakopmund. They're building a railway line. So in the picture next to us. So there's also starvation and dehydration, and prisoners received payment in small rations of food. This resulted in malnutrition, and women prisoners were actually given less food. And while maybe some men could share, we have to acknowledge the fact that there were less men than women, so there's not a lot of sharing going around. And then prisoned women were subjected to rape by the Schutztruppe and German soldiers, and diseases and poor health with no medical attention. Here and there, they maybe let a missionary come in, but overall, there was just fast rates of death, and the prisoners of war could really not cope with all of this labor and conditions. Prisoners of war were also exposed to extreme weather conditions with poor shelter, if any shelter was even provided. And this is one of the most parts that still is an issue when it comes to German-Namibia relationships, are the issues of skulls. So many hundreds of skulls were transported to Germany for scientific research. Female prisoners were forced to boil the heads of their own people, including their relatives, and scrape the flesh, sinews, and ligaments off the skulls with shards of broken glass. When we talk about intergenerational trauma, I don't think we can ever begin to really capture what that means. So we have the end of the genocide, where the Kaisers gave an order that said, and this was actually during the genocide, where all Ovaherero and some Nama land, because not all Namas were attacked, but the ones that rebelled were. So the Nama land and Ovaherero land were confiscated as of 1905. This allowed room for more German settlers to arrive and occupy land. So this genocide really solidified settler colonialism. And the last concentration camp closed in April 1908. German colonial records reported that of the 15,000 Herero and 2,000 Nama in captivity, more than half perished. Estimated figures, and there's a lot of different figures of the total number of deaths from the genocide, and this includes the civilian attacks, the war, the hunt campaign, concentration camps, and so to say the Omaheke Desert, which we can never ever fully count the total loss. But in 1908, 16,300 out of 100,000 Ovaherero were alive. And this is with 1,000 or so having escaped to modern Botswana. They're not factored into this. And also a lot of these, there were also a lot of mixed race children that were coming out of the concentration camps as well. But of course, they were not claimed by their German fathers. There's no way of knowing who they belong to. So they were a lot of mixed race children, which is why you still see today Ovaherero people, some of them can have a lighter skin tone. And in 1908, 13,000 of 20,000 Nama were alive. So the general estimate is that 80% of the Ovaherero were killed during this genocide. So legacies of the genocide in today's context. It's been a long road to justice. And I think people, just because the story is reaching international news now, so to say, this has been such a huge part of the identities of many Namibians, and especially those of the affected communities. So restoration becomes an identity and has been an identity. People think that the reparation claims just happened in a vacuum. It's been happening for over a century. So the confiscated land was never returned, and survivors were reduced to wage laborers. In 1915, Namibia becomes a South African mandate, and mind you, some of the locals even helped the South African army overthrow the German army in Namibia with the promise of restoration, but then that never happened. So you have the new paramount chief formally request for the return of some land in 1919, and that was denied. You have in the 1940s, the UN campaign for independence, and this was primarily led by Herero nationalism, but there was so many at this point. The political scene in Namibia has changed. You have other groups now being targeted by South Africa also come into play and also want independence, because then this means restoration. When I can get control over my land and my rights, I can get my land back. And in 1948, we have apartheid. So it's a long, messy history where many Namibians have gone through colonialism, but the Ovaherero and Nama have a specific case where they have gone through apartheid, but previous to that, they have also gone through a genocide. So, and throughout this apartheid, their hope for independence really was for restoration. So independence comes very late, 1990. And this is where I'm not going to go through this history just due to time, but we have a very long history starting in 1995 with the first official demand for reparations, which have been denied, but some skulls have been returned. And recently we've the two governments have entered negotiations with concerning reparations. So, but the current legacies are still present, and the reality is that the legacies are visible in Namibia, whereas they're not visible in Germany, which is why you have a disconnect. So the Ovaherero, who were once a dominant force in Namibia, are now a minority group. This has affected their democratic power, as numbers are crucial in a democracy. And the one interview I did with the spokesperson of the traditional authority of the Ovaherero, he said, like, we used to be so majestic and we are now a minority group. And while they still are a prominent force in Namibia and still a majestic group, and they've still have, despite it all, they own land and farms, they still are not what they used to be. And they have been reduced to a minority group. And central land continues to be owned by white farmers. So, and not just German farmers. With the South African occupation, you have English and Afrikaans settlers coming in as well. And this also includes ancestral land that used to belong to the Ovaherero and Nama, which they may never get back. And then you have economic inequalities that are linked to the loss of land, cattle, and wealth. So there's a group in the north, the Ovambo, who still have a stronghold on their land. That, you know, even though with inequalities of apartheid, they still have a stronghold on their land. So this is where we have to accept that the Ovaherero and Nama have gone through something different, a little different. And the descendants' identities are impacted by intergenerational trauma. So as we come to an end, we have to address decolonization and memorialization in Namibia, which is something that I'm very excited to hear is happening in Germany, because I think it's so important. When we look at memorialization, it carries narratives, it carries meanings, and it signals to an individual or a group whether there's space and acknowledgement for their experiences and or grievances. And memorialization is a form of symbolic reparations. I'm not going to get into the whole reparations scope right now, but symbolic reparations should accompany material reparations. It's not good enough to just hand over money when there's no symbolic gestures that accompany that really gives the weight to your narrative, and it verifies your experiences matter. So many grievances in Namibia and Africa that are rooted in historical injustices are embedded in colonialism. Therefore, in Namibia, decolonization and memorialization should go hand in hand. And as mentioned, we have attracted the largest German settler population, so to say. And so I just wanted to take us through some of these images with some of the monuments in Namibia and some of the attempts at the decolonization of our own national memory. So German colonial heritage in Namibia has until recently dominated public space in Namibia. And these are images of heroic sacrifice of the German soldier who to others were a killer and a rapist. And the military might of the German army and colonialism features in statues, memorial sites, and street names. Huge disconnect. So here we have the Marine Denkmal, which was erected in Swakopmund, 1908. And this really was, it's a homage to the lost soldiers of the Ovaherero War, which was in comparison, not a lot. And as I said, when they were attacking civilians, they were recorded as battles, but they were burning down villages, and there are no records of German soldiers actually dying in those instances. So this statue is very disputed, and there's actually a movement that's trying to take this statue down. It stands in Swakopmund, a coastal town where a lot of German settlers settled at the time, and it stands in front of our state house, the Swakopmund State House. So this doesn't make sense for Namibian national memory and landscape. And out of protest, someone, seeing as the statue is not taken down, red paint has been thrown onto it. So to show that the blood of the Ovaherero and Nama people, which is not represented in this statue. This here's a picture of a concentration camp that was behind the Ultrafesta fort, and it is in Windhoek. And here they had a concentration camp right behind it. Today, or previously, the Ultrafesta, this is what it looked like. This is an unknown German soldier, but it was erected in 1912, and it's a memorial that celebrated the might of the German Empire. Today, that statue was taken down, and today this statue was erected in 2014, and almost 100 years after that previous statue was put up. And here it's called the Genocide Memorial Statue. It's right next to our Independence Memorial Statue, where it's not just about, it's about the early resistance that takes us through to the liberation of Namibia. But it starts with the genocide. And at the bottom, it reads, "Their blood waters our freedom." And beneath, you can see the picture. This is a very famous photograph of the German Schutztruppe, or soldiers, watching as they hang Namibian civilians. Here we have a memorial site, and this is a mass graveyard in Swakopmund, where right next to it you have a small cemetery where a lot of German settlers have been buried, but you have all the names of the German soldiers who died written there. And right behind there, you've got a mass grave of unnamed Namibians who will never be able to know their names. So here it says, "In memory of the 1,000 heroic Ovaherero and Ovambandero who perished under mysterious circumstances at the realm of their German colonial masters in concentration camps in Swakopmund." And mind you, this has been an issue. This was put up in 2007. The term genocide should have explicitly been put here, but that is another debate. I wanted to end us off with some of just the cultural displays, the art, in the art scene. This was a very powerful art exhibition by Isabel Kachavivi, she is Ovaherero, and this exhibition was called "They Try to Bury Us." So it's this history that has been buried, but it reflects that, you know, every few years we uncover a mass grave somewhere, and it can only be assumed that it's from the genocide. And a lot of them have been proven to be from the genocide. So you keep uncovering skulls, but they, you know, they're buried, but we find them. So it's a history we can no longer ignore, and we cannot bury it. And this piece with the woman specifically that I'm circling around, the artist made sure that it was a female, because it's also the female narrative of the genocide that has also been buried. Something also Namibians need to work on a little bit better. And lastly, with street names, we have changed a lot of street names in Namibia. We had a Kaiser street name that was changed to Independence Avenue, Samnioma Avenue. So we've been changing street names. However, we still have a lot of street names that need to be changed. For example, the Voorman street name, which is a huge issue considering that the Voorman shipping line were allowed to open a private concentration camp specifically for their business, you know, and their business that exists till today, or not. So it's this kind of idea that we still have these street names that exist. And I just wanted to leave us with the von Trotter Street, because he is, so to say, the mastermind, him and the Kaiser of the genocide. Yet there's a von Trotter Street in a town called Otjiwarongo, and there is one just kind of around the corner from where I'm sitting. And so we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to this. Let me come back. Yeah, so a lot, we covered quite a lot. And again, I don't think 45 minutes or 30 minutes will ever do this topic justice. I hope that as maybe I can answer more specific questions. However, in Namibia, this is still a very sore point. And it's interesting because we have to deal with it from so many fronts where we are engaged with the German government. The German government is has the responsibility from the Imperial Germany all the way through the decades has come down to the current German government. And it's not to say that the German government is guilty or that the current German population is guilty. And this is where we need to look at ideas of or shifting narratives that maybe makes German descendants in Namibia, but also in Germany, open to the idea of unlearning their heritage and history that says, well, maybe it was the position I am in today has affected another community. And it's something that I've also had to address because I am half German. So it's not to say that it's just something that needs to come into national consciousness. And I think that decolonizing spaces is a first step. Introducing it into your German history curriculums is also another big step, because the way that Germany has handled the Holocaust is the benchmark. It's absolutely the benchmark in terms of probably the best reconciliation we have seen worldwide, especially when you think of all the other atrocities and slavery in America. We have also the genocides in other countries, the Native Americans. We see that what Germany did with the Holocaust can only be applied to other people, should also look to that. And it's not just Germany that has to address their colonial past. However, we need to bring it into national consciousness, because especially if we're discussing material reparations, and that's German taxpayers' money, if I don't understand why my tax money is going to another country, that's not reconciliation. And just to end off on this, in Namibia, we still also have a lot of work to do, and especially when it comes to protests from the German descendants that we call German Namibians. When it comes to the German Namibians, we have, when it comes to, the German Namibians, there is sometimes protest when it says, okay, we want to take down this statue. It actually offends a lot of people. And they'll say, well, you're taking down my heritage. And you know, that statue, the Reiter Denkmal that I showed earlier, that was taken down. There's a pub close by owned by a Namibian German. And when you walk in, there's a little mini Reiter Denkmal statue sitting behind the bar with all the German beer and everything. So, of course, we have so much work to do. And the German private school recently has also introduced this topic into their curriculum. So we are not finished. And I think doing symbolic reparations and decolonizing spaces is not the ends to a mean, but it's the first step. It's the first thing we can do so that it's part of national consciousness. And then we can actually get to the real work, which is really uplifting the people who have been wronged. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very impressive presentation. I think and it was what some of the audience said. For a moment, it left us speechless, because you spoke about very crucial times of Namibian history. So thank you very much for this insight in a very difficult history. I see we have some questions.
Yes.
The first question is, what I know is that the lands are still in white settlers' hands. So why are they not given back and compensated? Instead, the government has to buy it back.
Well, this is, you see, it's so tricky, because when it comes to historical injustices, the debate comes up. If I take away someone else's wealth who is not directly responsible and is not the individual who committed the crime, can I take back can I take back that land? And, you know, I have to compensate you. And the thing is, Namibia did have a national reconciliation policy at independence, where they said that it's really just about rebuilding the society. We cannot undo the past. That is still an issue because you have German farmers that own massive plots of land, and then you have a small Nama community that is living on a strip of land that was kind of where they were resettled into, that is honestly a fraction of it. It's almost the size of a football field. So it's a very tricky question, but ultimately the law and the way it works, and with historical injustices, it's very hard to pinpoint. That's why the reparation program has to address land. They all say like land has to be part of the reparation program. It has to fall in line in a modern context where if land is given back, and this is commercial land that also now contributes to the national economy, the government has a responsibility to the Namibian economy and Namibia at large, not just two groups of Namibians. So this is the approach they've taken, and there has been a lot of dispute in terms of, I want my land back. That unfortunately we've seen in Zimbabwe when land was taken so quickly, and you see how the economy collapsed. So when I did my research, when I did my interviews with some government officials, they are saying, look, the land has to be addressed, but we cannot address it in a way that we've seen has led to failure. On top of it, if you give the land to, let's say, Ovaherero group, and they cannot produce in a modern context the land, products, then you've set them up for failure. So purchasing land is a crucial part of the reparation program, but it is a willing, and I think this is where the local white farmers need to be sensitized, because we cannot wait for them to say, yes, I'm willing to sell this land. They need to come to the table, and they need to be very considerate and very sensitive to this matter. And not just, reparations is a very personal thing. If I've wronged you and you've come to me so many times and I'm just very defensive about it, versus when I actually open up to your trauma and I say, you know what, actually, Dr. Jessica, I am sorry, and I don't feel good in this moment, but I'm willing to do the work. That reparations is actually not a complex idea when you take it to a personal level of two people who've wronged each other. So the German and white farmers have to come to the table. They have to be part of this process. And that is the next steps that Namibia has to implement. And then we have to also give training. It's a development program as well. And it's not to say development aid and reparations is the same thing, but we have to apply reparations to developing Namibia based on our national reconciliation policy that we adopted in 1990. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question, and I think it's as well very interesting, is why are there so many monuments, street names, etc., honoring the perpetrators of colonial oppression and genocide in Namibia still? Is the topic controversial?
Thank you for that question. This is the question we're all asking. Why are they still around? Because I think when you look at when these monuments were put up, early colonial periods, or just following the genocide, we have many decades that stretch that leads us to independence. And that was still in the name of white settler colonialism, but just under the South African, Dutch and British settler colonialism that expanded into Namibia. So essentially, while Germany and the British were at war in World War I, when they came in, they realized that they could not, the German settlers added so much value to the economy, which they could see as a benefit. So they decided there were some economic disputes. However, they allowed the Germans to just continue with their way of life for the sake of white settler colonialism, so that they can also come in and overlook. And as I mentioned in one of the slides, the Ovaherero were already requesting for restoration. And you have all of this maintain itself. And then you have a policy of national reconciliation where we say, okay, you know, we draw a line in the sand. And that's how some people have referred to it, drawing a line in the sand and saying, okay, that part's done. But that doesn't work because that history is still haunting us today. So these monuments have been up for, I mean, the one monument has been up for over a century. The one with the 2 German soldiers has been up since 1908. We are now in 100+ years later, and it's still standing up. So this is really a part where I think our national reconciliation policy does need to be amended a little bit, just so that there is some accountability. I think that German locals, and I'm happy that the German private school is starting to introduce this topic into their content, because when I come into your house, or let's say you come into my house and you say you're going to take down all of these masks behind me, and I don't understand why, I'm going to be defensive about it. So we need to start with national consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question is, I've been wondering how Namibian memory institutions such as museums address colonial statues and street names.
So thank you for that question. They've been in the forefront actually of changing the names, and you know, when you go into their records, you have a full record since 1990, since our independence, how many street names have changed, and it is a slow process. They also oversaw the Independence Memorial statue. So there's that one hill that I showed you with the Ultrafesta where there's a concentration camp. And then for decades, for the first 2 decades of our independence, you don't know that that was an area of atrocity. And a part of symbolic reparations is turning sites of atrocities into sites of memory and consciousness. So the museums and some of these institutions, even the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture, they have actually been in the forefront of doing this change. Again, as I mentioned, there is financial issues, there's sometimes political issues around them, but at the end of the day, they're the ones who've been doing most of the work in it. They still have a lot of work to do, and I don't think now that this topic, while it has hit international news in a big way, and while it has also hit Germany in a big way, I also grew up not knowing all of this history. So they inherited from apartheid ministries and institutions that still had to be decolonized. And that is where we are at right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I'm right, there's one last question.
All right.
Oh yeah, now, if you can give a very short answer to it.
Okay.
It is, sorry, it is, how does one define a settlement under international law? Is it a property of the occupying state?
Sorry?
The question is, how does one define a settlement under international law? Is it a property of the occupying state?
Okay, a settlement, I'm assuming land settlement?
I think so.
Okay, so I'm not a law expert. I have looked at the legal issues in this area, and I must say, I think a lot of the time when we only apply a legal scope to an issue, when we say the word injustice and then we look at it through a legal scope, we'll never get to the truth of it, because I think that legality is also, it comes with a position of power. And when it comes to the Namibian land and settlement, there is a huge issue because the Ovaherero were not the first groups in Namibia that settled in central Namibia. They also had local conflicts that pushed out, let's say, the Damara. So when we say, okay, how do we define a settlement and who should own it, that enters a political realm or social political realm, I think personally. And the treaties that were drawn up before Germany came up, between Ovaherero and Namas, did push out, let's say, the Damaras, which is why the government is, when it comes to the reparation program that they're designing, they are saying that it's for the Ovaherero and the Nama, but it's going to affected areas because the whole area has been so devastated in terms of, and also Damara and San people were also, a few individuals were a few hundreds were in the concentration camps, but they were not targeted as a group, but obviously they offered protection at times to Ovaherero, which is why they got caught up in it. So that's why they're saying it's just affected areas. But I'm not sure if I'm answering the question. I just think that when we look at land settlement and the legal standards, especially international standards, I don't think we'll ever get to the heart of it. I don't think we'll ever be able to give that answer justice either. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Once more, thank you very much for your impressive presentation. I think we all learned a lot.
I hope so. Thank you.